I never meant to get involved. I didn't ask for this. It all started when I moved into this apartment complex, a tired old building that had seen better days. The walls creaked, the floors groaned, and the hallway lights flickered like a bad omen. But rent was cheap, and the location was perfect. I needed a fresh start, far away from the chaos of my past, and this place seemed like the ideal escape. I told myself I was only here for a few months, a temporary fix, but that was before I met him. His name was Mr. Thompson, or at least that's what the mail said. He lived in the apartment across from mine, at the end of the hall. When I first moved in, I'd barely seen him. I'd heard rumors from the other tenants, how strange he was, how quiet, how he never left his apartment. But people talk, don't they? And besides, I had my own life to live. Who cared about some reclusive neighbor? The first few days passed uneventfully. The hum of the fridge, the sound of the plumbing at odd hours, the occasional knock on my door from a neighbor asking about the Wi-Fi code. It was all normal, in a way that only a new place can be. But it wasn't until the third day, when I passed Mr. Thompson's apartment on my way to the laundry room, that I first noticed something strange. His door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the dim light from inside spilling into the hallway. A shiver crawled up my spine. I could have sworn I saw movement, just a flicker in the corner of my eye, but when I glanced again, there was nothing. No sound. No one. But the door was still open. I tried to shake off the feeling. It was nothing, just my imagination, I told myself. Still, the thought of Mr. Thompson lingered in my mind. It was an odd thing to feel curious about, an apartment complex full of strangers, and I fixated on the one man who never seemed to exist. That night, I heard him. It was just after midnight. I was reading in bed, the soft rustle of pages the only sound in the room. Then, a faint tapping, like fingernails on wood. At first, I thought it was a neighbor's door, or maybe just the building settling. But the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I glanced at the clock, 12:15 a.m. The tapping continued, soft at first, then louder. It came from across the hall, Mr. Thompson's apartment. I was about to ignore it. Maybe it was just the wind or some other sound I couldn't place. But then it happened again. A distinct knock, sharp and deliberate, followed by silence. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong. I didn't know what, but I knew that sound wasn't normal. I waited, heart hammering in my chest. Seconds felt like hours. The silence was oppressive, but the weight of it pushed me to act. I didn't know why, but I found myself standing up, slowly walking to the door. My hand hovered over the handle, but I hesitated. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe him, maybe someone else. But I couldn't bring myself to open the door. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before I heard the unmistakable creak of floorboards. Someone was moving inside, but the footsteps were slow, deliberate, dragging as though reluctant to move. The hairs on my arms stood up. I didn't know why, but everything inside me screamed to run, to get away from that door, from whatever was behind it. But curiosity had taken root, and I couldn't ignore it. I waited for what seemed like forever, my hand still gripping the door handle. Finally, I forced myself to take a breath and turned the knob. The door creaked open with a groan, and for a split second, my heart stopped. Mr. Thompson's apartment was dark, shrouded in shadows. The only light came from a small lamp in the far corner, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air smelled musty, stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The space seemed frozen in time, untouched, as though no one had ever lived there. "Mr. Thompson?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. I immediately regretted it. There was no answer. I stepped into the apartment, each footfall echoing in the silence. My eyes scanned the room, but there was nothing unusual. No furniture out of place, no sign of life. Just dust. And that eerie silence. But something was off. I could feel it. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My eyes lingered on the corner where the lamp flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to shift with every passing moment. A cold chill swept over me, and I quickly turned to leave, but as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the table by the window, was a picture frame. It was an old photo, yellowed with age, and in it was Mr. Thompson. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his lips stretched into a thin, uncomfortable smile. But that wasn't what unsettled me. What chilled me to the core was the fact that Mr. Thompson looked wrong. He looked exactly like the man I had seen in the hallway, but there was something unearthly about his features. I could barely breathe. My chest tightened, and I took a step back, ready to bolt out of the apartment, but then I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak from behind me. I froze. There was someone standing in the doorway. The shadowy figure was tall, too tall, and its presence felt like it had always been there, waiting. My stomach dropped. My pulse quickened, and a scream lodged itself in my throat, but I couldn't make a sound. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, staring. And that's when I realized. It wasn't Mr. Thompson. It was something else, something that had taken his place. The figure stepped forward, and I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. My feet barely touched the ground as I raced back to my apartment, slamming the door behind me. I locked it quickly, my hands trembling. But as I sat on the floor, my back pressed against the door, my heart still racing, I knew one thing for sure. Mr. Thompson wasn't the man I thought he was. He wasn't a reclusive neighbor. He was something else, something far darker, and I had only just scratched the surface of the truth. I had to know more, but I was terrified of what I might find. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The image of the figure standing in Mr. Thompson's doorway haunted my thoughts. I kept seeing his eyes, or rather, the empty sockets where his eyes should have been. I couldn't tell if I had imagined it or if it was real, but the terror was all-consuming. Every creak of the building, every flutter of a curtain, made me jump. By morning, I was exhausted but determined. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't let this go. Something told me that whatever was happening with Mr. Thompson wasn't just an isolated incident. There was something bigger at play here, something wrong with the building itself, with the man, or whatever he was. I decided to investigate. I had to be cautious. I didn't want to make the mistake of rushing in without thinking, but I knew I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to uncover its secrets. The hallway was eerily quiet that morning. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above me, their weak glow casting long shadows along the peeling wallpaper. I made my way to the apartment door across from mine, the door I had so hastily closed the night before. My heart pounded with every step, my stomach twisted in knots. I knew I was crossing a line, something I couldn't undo, but there was no going back now. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still, nothing. It was as if the apartment was empty, but I knew it wasn't. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sound, any sign of life. There was nothing. The silence pressed against me, thick and suffocating. I didn't want to, but I had to do it. I turned the knob. The door creaked open just like it had the night before. My pulse quickened. I stepped inside, and immediately the strange, musty smell hit me again, the air still heavy with an oppressive stillness. Nothing had changed since the night before. The lamp was still flickering weakly in the corner, the dust on the table untouched. But as I walked deeper into the apartment, something felt wrong. The room wasn't just quiet. It was too quiet. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air thick with a sense of dread. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, a door that had been closed the night before was now wide open. It led to what looked like a small, darkened hallway. I hadn't noticed it last time, but now it seemed to call to me, urging me forward. I couldn't stop myself. My feet moved before my mind could catch up. I walked toward the darkened hallway, the silence following me like a heavy shadow. As I passed through the doorway, I felt a cold draft that made me shiver. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and the narrow hallway stretched out before me, disappearing into an even darker space. I hesitated. Something inside me screamed to turn back, but I ignored it. I stepped forward. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy, the air thick with something I couldn't name. And then, at the end of the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A mirror. It was old, its edges ornate, but cracked. The glass shimmered with an unnatural light, flickering as if it was alive. As I stepped closer, I saw something in the reflection that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't me. It was him, Mr. Thompson. But he wasn't alive. He stood in the reflection, his face pale, hollow, with an unnatural grin stretching across his lips. His eyes were empty sockets. His skin was decayed, the flesh hanging off his bones in places. And yet, he was smiling at me, smiling as if he knew something I didn't. I stumbled back, my heart racing. What was this? Why was he in the mirror? Why was he smiling at me? I turned to run, but then I heard a voice, a whisper, low and distant, coming from the reflection. "Help me!" The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. But I heard it. It was him, Mr. Thompson. His voice was weak, desperate, but there was something else, something wrong in it. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had to leave, that I had no business being here. But before I could move, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, the chill sinking into my bones. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. A figure in the doorway, standing motionless, watching me. It was Mr. Thompson, or at least it looked like him. But his face was different. His eyes were wide, too wide, and his smile was stretched unnaturally, like it was too big for his face. It didn't reach his eyes. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, my vision blurring. The figure took a step forward, and I bolted, running as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear it, the slow, steady footsteps following me. When I reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I backed away from the door, pressing my back against the wall as if it could protect me from whatever had been following me. But then, as I stood there, I realized something else. I hadn't seen Mr. Thompson in the hallway. He hadn't been in the building at all. The figure I had seen, the one I had mistaken for him, wasn't him at all. It was something else. Something had been impersonating him. Something that was now watching me. I couldn't stay in this apartment. I couldn't stay in this building. But I couldn't leave either. Not yet. I had to find out what was going on. I had to find out what had happened to Mr. Thompson and what was now taking his place. I wasn't going to sleep tonight. I had too many questions. And there was one thing I was certain of. I had already made a dangerous mistake by investigating. But I wasn't going to stop. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes darted around the apartment as I paced, trying to collect my thoughts, trying to make sense of the nightmarish events that had been spiraling out of control since I'd moved into this cursed building. The air felt thicker than before, heavier somehow. It wasn't just the darkness or the cold anymore. It was something deeper, more suffocating. The mirror. That damn mirror. It was all I could think about. I couldn't understand it. Was it really Mr. Thompson I'd seen in there, or something far more sinister? Why had he been trying to reach out to me? And more importantly, who or what had been pretending to be him? The whisper, "Help me." It echoed in my mind, chilling my bones every time I thought about it. It wasn't his voice. It wasn't him. But the reflection had been too real, too vivid. There was no denying it. Something was trapped in that mirror. Something that had a malevolent grip on this building. On me. I couldn't stay here any longer. But I couldn't leave either. I couldn't live with this uncertainty, this constant dread. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had no choice. I had to uncover the truth, and to do that, I had to go back to the source. I had to face the mirror again. The night was unnaturally quiet. Not a sound in the hallways, no footsteps, no distant noises from other apartments. I stood in front of my apartment door, my hand resting on the knob. My heart beat in my ears. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, to forget it, and leave the building for good. But I had come this far. I walked down the hallway toward Mr. Thompson's apartment, my legs moving like they had a mind of their own. The door loomed ahead, that cursed door that I had once thought would be just another nondescript part of the building. Now it was the gateway to the unknown, to something ancient and terrifying. I stepped inside once again. Nothing had changed. The furniture, the lamp, the dusty smell, everything was just as I'd left it. But the room felt different this time. The temperature had dropped even further, and I could see my breath as I exhaled. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. The mirror, the cursed mirror, was still there, reflecting the dim light of the room, its cracked surface staring back at me like an open wound. I could feel it, the pressure, the weight of something invisible but overwhelmingly present. And there, at the end of the hallway, the door to the dark passage was still open. I took a step toward it, my feet heavy, my body urging me to flee. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I approached the mirror, my eyes unwillingly drawn to its reflective surface. It was worse this time. The reflection rippled like water, distorting the room behind me, and for a moment I thought I saw movement. something shifting in the dark corners, something watching from within the glass. And then I saw him, Mr. Thompson, or at least what I thought had been Mr. Thompson. This time, he was different. His face was gaunter, his skin even more decayed, his eyes completely hollow. But it wasn't just his appearance that disturbed me. It was the thing behind him, standing just out of sight. I couldn't make out the details at first, but it was huge. Something monstrous, its shape shifting and stretching, almost as though it was fighting to get out. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing, my stomach twisting with nausea. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was choking. The air in the room grew even colder, and then the whisper again. "Help me! I can't leave! You have to stop it!" This time the voice wasn't faint. It wasn't weak. It was desperate, frantic. It was like someone had taken all the terror of 1,000 trapped souls and poured it into one voice. I stepped forward, compelled by the words. The urge to help, to do something, anything, was overwhelming. I had to free whatever was trapped in that mirror. I had to end this. But when I reached out toward the surface, my fingers stopped just short of touching it. The reflection moved. The figure behind Mr. Thompson's decayed form twisted and turned, growing larger, its form becoming clearer. It wasn't a man. It wasn't even human. The thing in the mirror had sharp, jagged limbs, blackened skin, and an elongated head. Its eyes were two glowing orbs, burning with malicious intent, and it was looking straight at me. I froze. I couldn't look away. It smiled, but it wasn't a smile. It was a grotesque rictus, a mocking distortion of human emotion. And then it did something that made my blood run cold. It reached out. For a split second, I felt its hand, no, its claw, touch my shoulder. I screamed, stumbling backward, tearing my gaze away from the mirror. I was shaking, trembling so violently that I thought I might collapse. My body was still reeling from the shock, but my mind wouldn't let me stop. I had to finish this. I had to get answers. I couldn't leave until I knew what was going on. And then it hit me. The realization that sent my heart into a freefall. Mr. Thompson had never been the real threat. He had been the victim. Trapped in the mirror, his soul locked away, forced to watch as something else, something ancient and evil, took his place in the real world. The thing that had been pretending to be Mr. Thompson wasn't just a ghost. It wasn't just an evil spirit. It was something far older. Something that had been lurking in the shadows for years, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And it had found its moment. As I turned to flee, I felt the air shift again. Something dark followed me, its presence oppressive, suffocating. It was the thing from the mirror, and now it was here. The hallway stretched in front of me, the exit so close, but I could hear it coming. Closer, closer, the footsteps echoing like a death march. I ran, my heart in my throat, my lungs burning. But just as I reached the door, I felt a hand on my arm. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing, except for the reflection in the mirror. It had me now.